This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to This Week in the Boardroom. I'm Scott Cutler, Executive Vice President with NYSE Euronext, and today I'm joined by a very special guest, Harvey Pitt, who served as the 26th Chairman of the SEC and is currently the CEO of global consulting firm Colorama. Thank you, Harvey, for joining the show today.
It's good to be with you, Scott.
Today we have a very interesting topic, a topic that has been an area of focus for many of the issuers out there and is also the subject of the Proxy plumbing release. And that really is around the proxy advisory services firms. And the topic is really the U.S. Chamber publishing the proxy advisory guidelines. Now, this has been a topic that we addressed a couple of years ago as part of the NYSE Corporate Governance Commission. As I just stated, this was part of the Proxy plumbing release in 2010. Maybe you can give us a little bit of background based on your experience, the past discussions at the SEC around this topic, and then how these guidelines came about at the Chamber, and what is your involvement with these guidelines?
Dating back to 2002 and 2003, when I was chair of the SEC, we passed a rule that required investment portfolio manager organizations to develop policies as to how they would vote the shares of corporation securities that they held in their portfolios. In that release, the Commission indicated that voting was an exercise of fiduciary responsibility, and that portfolio managers should have policies with respect to that. After I left the Commission in 2004, two staff no-action letters effectively facilitated the ability of portfolio managers to outsource their fiduciary obligations, to rely upon proxy advisory firms rather than exercise their own judgments with respect to voting. And from there, a lot of issues have been created. Proxy advisory firms are firms that do not fall within the pantheon of entities regulated by any agency whatsoever. There are no set standards for transparency. And effectively, two firms, ISS and Glass Lewis, control 97% of the business for proxy advisory firms. Although the Commission had determined to look at this issue, it has a lot on its plate. And over the years, although it's promised to take a closer look at this issue, it has not had the wherewithal to do that. In the meantime, public companies are very confused about the right way to deal with proxy advisory firms, since there's no transparency as to how these firms develop their positions, and there's little opportunity for input. Part of the problem is that these two firms have a disproportionate effect on corporate governance, and so the Chamber thought it would be useful for it to develop a set of core principles that apply to the three components of the proxy voting process: public companies, investment portfolio manager organizations, and of course proxy advisory firms. And in addition to laying out core principles, thought it would be helpful to lay out some best practices so that people could understand the best way to interface with these entities.
So let's just talk a little bit about some of those recommendations. One of them is conflict of interest. One of them is actually creating a fair and transparent process to be able to respond to issues that are raised. Maybe you can go into a little bit more detail about what are some of those specific recommendations.
In the first instance, proxy advisory firms, unfortunately, have devised a system that is effectively one size fits all. That doesn't work because every corporation is different. And while there may be certain generic principles that one could apply to most corporations, this process does not work when you have people articulating positions that aren't devoted to the interests of the shareholders whose corporations are affected by these votes. And so what the Chamber did, and I think has come up with a very workable set of best practices, is to start with proxy advisory firms and talk about the fact that they should be transparent, they should be free from conflict, they should apply true due diligence, they should offer corporations the opportunity to inform them about mistaken judgments that proxy advisory firms often make. There have been a lot of studies recently of the impact of proxy advisory firms, and while, as I said a moment ago, their effect on corporate governance is disproportionate, the other aspect of this is that they have made some significant mistakes on time, as we all do. And those mistakes aren't necessarily deliberate, but they result from a process that isn't transparent, that doesn't allow a public company to provide the proxy advisory firm with information. The two firms that dominate the market, as I indicated, have separate but very powerful conflicts of interest. ISS, for example, at the same time that it purports to recommend positions about proxy votes, also provides services to the very same companies, offering to help them avoid some of the negative recommendations that ISS may ultimately make. There's a clear conflict there, and some companies think the only way to avoid a problem with a proxy advisory firm is to retain them for these other services. That shouldn't be the case. They should be retained if there's a valuable service that they can provide and a need on the part of the company. So one element is to allow public companies to provide essential information. Glass Lewis is owned by an activist investor in Canada, which takes its own activist positions. As a result, its recommendations may reflect the views of its activist owner and don't necessarily reflect the views of the companies about which it's purporting to opine. So dealing with conflicts, making sure that shareholders are not adversely affected by these conflicts, making sure that public companies have an opportunity to provide essential data, and then doing the necessary due diligence. There are some 250,000 proxy voting issues in any proxy season, and ISS, for example, has 198 people doing the research on these 250,000 issues. There are serious questions about whether you can do effective due diligence with that small a group of people. So these are issues that the Chamber's best practices, as well as core principles, are designed to flesh out and get a discussion going so that people can effectively contribute other ideas, and the private sector working together will come up with a workable approach to all of these issues.
I thought it was interesting that you noted that the original intent was focused on the fiduciary duty of investment managers, and that these no action letters that you cited essentially created a system where the investment managers can essentially outsource that voting responsibility to the proxy advisory firms. They don't want to deal with it. They don't want to have the costs associated with the infrastructure. Is there any hope in all of this that either the SEC could revise its position there? Would it have to revise its position to focus on the issue from an investment manager perspective, from a fiduciary duty perspective?
Well, I think a number of investment management organizations are taking steps to inform themselves and to use a proxy advisory firm as only one element in a series of information gathering efforts. I also think that the likelihood of formal SEC action is remote, and candidly, I'm not sure it's necessary. There's a clear need for action, but I'm not sure it needs to be regulatory action. What the SEC can do, and hopefully will do, will be to say this is a constructive first step without embracing any of the principles or best practices. It can suggest to people that everyone should work together constructively to take this initial effort and build on it so we come up with a set of workable principles that satisfy all three legs of this corporate governance arena.
When you look at how this plays out going forward, this was something that the SEC asked for comments. I think it received the most comments in this particular area in 2010, the proxy plumbing release. There's still a lot of things that are left to be done on Dodd-Frank. While there's a lot of discussion and anxiousness to try and get something done here, how do you see this issue playing out with the SEC and the industry over the next 12 to 18 months?
My hope is that the staff of the SEC, in particular, will take steps to encourage all participants to work toward coming up with a workable set of mutually acceptable best practices. I also am optimistic that members of the Commission will support this effort. Here's a real opportunity for the Commission to have a considerable impact on corporate governance without formal rulemaking. And that, it seems to me, is an opportunity that shouldn't be wasted. And hopefully, with a new chairman coming in as well, the commissioners will embrace the concept as opposed to specific provisions of the document. But with that embracing, facilitate the ability to come up with a final document that everyone can sign on to.
Now, my last question is really more of advice, particularly to the directors that tune into this program. What is your best advice in terms of boards either responding to or engaging when the issue arises with the proxy advisory firms on areas such as compensation seems to be a hot button issue? What's your best advice in this interim period for the directors to engage?
I think that we are entering a period where corporate directors have to become more accessible and more visible for public companies. This is not in any way to suggest that they give up their full-time jobs and just devote themselves to being directors. But I do think that particularly outside directors come to the job with a stature and a status that is respected by almost everyone looking at the system. They're independent. They're not management. And even though management works very hard and tries to get the right things done, having independent directors understand how the compensation that has been decided upon was arrived at, what factors went into it, what checks and balances there are to satisfy the independent directors that the results are helping to provide a well-run corporation, will carry a great deal of weight if the spokesmen and women for these positions are independent directors. So I think the first step is for all of the independent directors, not just those on the comp committee, to understand the factors that went into this development of compensation. The second is to be aware of what some of the extrinsic criticisms are of certain methodologies, and to have responses available as to the reasons that, in a particular company's case, the approach selected makes good sense and the results are beneficial to shareholders. I then also think that there has to be an engagement of these proxy advisory firms. Many of the companies that complain about these firms are troubled by the fact that they take blanket positions without understanding the specifics of every individual company. The solution to that is for these companies and their directors to make sure that the proxy advisory firms aren't able to do that, that they understand why their compensation decisions are what they are and why people support them and why shareholders should support them. I think in that kind of a process, there's a lot of good that the directors can do, and hopefully without imposing so much of a burden on them that they'll find it impossible to still keep working at their day jobs.
Well, thank you, Mr. Pitt. This has been stimulating and engaging, and we appreciate your insights on this issue. For those people that are tuning in, we hope that this has been a program that helps you be a more effective board or committee chair. And so tune in next week as we approach and tackle another exciting topic on corporate governance. Thank you.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partners, the Center for Audit Quality and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.